President Donald Trump delayed some tariffs on Mexico and Canada.
She condemned them and promised retaliation.
Mexico, the silent game changer, just showed everyone they're done playing nice with Trump's stubborn tariffs.
Claudia Sheinbaum enjoys an 85% approval rating. I mean, that is a number almost unheard of in democracies today.
For the longest time, the world thought Mexico was quietly swallowing all of Trump's nonsense, but nope. They hit back with a move so wild it had all NATO countries scratching their heads.
Most powerful woman in the world.
Honestly, you've got to give them credit for pulling off this strategic retaliation.
Donald Trump rode back in relation to Mexico.
Now everyone is shocked because for years, Mexico was viewed as the silent partner in North American trade relations. While countries like Canada and Europe were making waves with their diplomatic moves, Mexico quietly went along with whatever the U.S. imposed.
The U.S., Mr. Trump says, the recent dramatic falls in financial markets, crashing to their lowest level since November last year, has nothing to do with his change of heart.
Mexico is the United States' largest trade partner, so her ability to negotiate with them certainly puts her in a strong position.
Mexico's reliance on the U.S. was well known. With over 80% of its exports directed northward, the country had a lot to lose in any trade conflict. But despite its dependence, Mexico didn't push back in a significant way when President Trump implemented tariffs on its goods. At least, not until recently.
President Trump's moves in his first term was to put tariffs or trade taxes on imports on washing machines coming into his country. This time just a few weeks in, and his twists and turns in trade policy have got the whole world trapped in a spin cycle, including those markets.
This shift in Mexico's approach came after months of aggressive tariff threats from Trump, specifically targeting key industries that were vital to Mexico's economy, like automotive, oil, and agriculture. President Claudia Sheinbaum, rising to prominence as the leader of Mexico's political scene, led this new wave of defiance.
Rather than just going ahead and taking these reciprocal measures, which would potentially result in blowback for her country, she's taken this cool, steady approach.
She was the face of this shift, taking a stand against the threat of tariffs that could cripple Mexico's economy. Mexico had made its position clear. If tariffs came, retaliation was on the table.
Investors are fearful that President Trump's policies will achieve the opposite of creating the jobs and growth that he hopes for. And that real-world evidence is mounting. The trade deficit has been widening.
This sudden shift in tactics wasn't just about pride. It was a necessary response to a looming threat that had the potential to cripple Mexico's economy. The U.S., under Trump's leadership, had threatened to impose a 25% tariff on Mexican goods. The tariffs were meant to protect U.S. industries from foreign competition, but the reality was far more complicated.
Are warning that President Trump is not just weaponizing trade, but uncertainty, and that could backfire.
Mexico's economy, deeply entwined with the U.S., was highly vulnerable. Its automotive sector alone accounts for 27% of its exports to the USA. Add in oil, which accounts for 8% of U.S. imports, and the agricultural products Mexico exports, such as avocados, tomatoes, and corn, and it's clear that a trade war could devastate the country.
Business confidence, consumer confidence, both falling in America. There's mutterings on Wall Street that far from making America great again, we may see the risk rising of a Trump session.
The moment Trump made those tariff threats, it was clear that the U.S. was gambling with the economic health of both nations. But the stakes were even higher for Mexico, where the threat of losing its largest trading partner could send its economy into a tailspin. The U.S. needed Mexico, but Mexico needed the U.S. just as much, if not more. The loss of Mexico's ability to export to the U.S. meant higher car prices, disruptions in the supply chain, and rising production costs for U.S. automakers.
And don't forget, any downturn there risks some fallout here.
And the impacts weren't limited to just the automotive industry. Oil, which flows from Mexico into the U.S. in massive quantities, was also at risk. Mexico provides a significant portion of the crude oil the U.S. refines, particularly in states like Texas and California. A disruption in that flow would send fuel prices soaring, putting even more pressure on the U.S. economy. already struggling with inflation and rising production costs.
Peso gained some ground against the dollar yesterday, registering its strongest level since the year began, but uncertainty remains as to whether the Mexican government will continue to take decisive action and prevent the auto manufacturing or agricultural industries from taking a major hit.
If Mexico decided to halt oil exports or raise prices in response to U.S. tariffs, the economic consequences would be severe. Americans would feel the pinch at the gas pump, and industries reliant on cheap energy would see their costs skyrocket. But Sheinbaum's strategic diplomacy, combined with Mexico's readiness to fight back, played a crucial role in stalling the impending disaster. Sheinbaum's government engaged in quiet diplomacy with U.S. lawmakers, business leaders, and farmers, pointing out the negative impacts of the tariffs. They made it clear that if the U.S. followed through on its threats, the consequences would be dire for both sides.
President Donald Trump delayed some tariffs on Mexico and Canada.
After intense negotiations, Trump agreed to delay the tariffs on Mexican goods for a month, giving both countries time to work out a solution. This decision was seen as a victory for Mexico, which had successfully averted the economic disaster that would have followed if the tariffs were imposed. It was a remarkable moment in the trade conflict, one that demonstrated Mexico's ability to stand up to the U.S. despite the massive power imbalance.
Mexico and Canada have been delayed for yet another month, buying some time for further negotiations while keeping the pressure on the Mexican government to address U.S. concerns on fentanyl and immigration. The markets received the news rather well. This exemption applies to about 90% of Mexican exports.
This delay, however, only bought time. The tariffs still loom large, and the potential for a renewed trade war remains high. Mexico, though, is now more prepared than ever. Sheinbaum's leadership has solidified her position as a formidable force in both Mexican and global politics, and her popularity has surged as a result of her diplomatic success. If the U.S. continues to escalate the trade conflict, Mexico is ready to respond, strategically, diplomatically, and with the strength of a nation that has learned how to fight back when its interests are threatened.
USMCA agreement, but we are still facing the tariffs on steel and aluminum that are set to go into effect next week.
The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, signed on November 30th, 2008, was a game changer in North American trade relations. This agreement replaced the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, which had been in place since 1994, and it aimed to modernize the economic framework between the three countries. The USMCA was positioned as a tool to level the playing field, particularly in areas such as labor standards, environmental protections, and intellectual property. But in the context of tariffs, it served as a double-edged sword for Mexico, offering some relief, but also leaving critical sectors exposed.
Next week, nonetheless, President Sheinbaum is moving ahead with a massive event planned to take place this coming Sunday at our country's.
Under the USMCA, several provisions were designed to protect key Mexican exports, particularly in the automotive industry. The agreement stipulated that Mexico would continue to benefit from tariff-free access to the U.S. market for automobiles, but it also included new rules. To qualify for this tariff exemption, automakers were required to use a higher percentage of U.S.-made parts, which directly impacted Mexico's extensive role in the supply chain. The automotive industry, which constitutes 27% of Mexico's exports to the U.S., was initially relieved by the promise of continued tariff-free trade, especially after the looming threat of Trump's 25% tariff on Mexican auto parts. This reprieve allowed Mexico to breathe easier for a time, ensuring that a significant part of its economy wouldn't face an immediate crisis.
It is still uncertain whether that would be enough to, actually reach the agreements that Trump has put on the table.
However, the USMCA was far from a complete shield. The agreement was designed with flexibility, allowing certain sectors to still face tariffs or rising costs. Notably, while many goods were exempt from tariffs under the New Deal, steel and aluminum were not. These materials, crucial for industries across both the US and Mexico, were left vulnerable to Trump's tariff policies. Mexico, as a major supplier of steel and aluminum to the US, faced a 25% tariff on these imports starting in June 2018. And despite the USMCA's provisions, this tariff remained in place.
We know that the next coming weeks will be crucial to determine whether this exemption will be a temporary pause or it can actually lead to a resolution and avoid a full economic clash between our two countries.
The steel and aluminum tariffs caused an immediate rise in production costs for manufacturers in both countries. The automotive industry, already dependent on Mexico for parts, was hit hard by the increased cost of raw materials. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, US-based automakers that relied heavily on Mexican suppliers, found themselves in a position where their margins were squeezed by tariffs on the materials used to build their cars.
Well, and we know it is a temporary pause because we're looking at an early April warning from the president that if they can't get anywhere between the two presidents, that this tariff could go back in place in full force.
These rising costs meant that American consumers were directly impacted, with car prices expected to rise by as much as $12,000 for certain models, like the Ford F-150, and the potential for factory closures loomed over both the US and Mexico. The USMCA had delivered some temporary relief, but it didn't shield Mexico from the full impact of Trump's tariff strategy. It only delayed the inevitable.
Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum just last hour responding to the imposition of those tariffs. She condemned them and promised retaliation, saying there is, quote, no justification for 25% tariffs on all of those imports.
In this context, President Claudia Sheinbaum used the USMCA to navigate a tense situation. Sheinbaum's approach was a blend of careful diplomacy and fierce national pride. As the president of Mexico, she found herself at the helm of a crucial moment. Despite the country's historical dependence on the U.S. for trade, Sheinbaum didn't back down when it came to protecting Mexico's economic interests. In the face of Trump's tariffs, she turned to the USMCA's framework as a way to delay the worst-case scenario, tariffs on goods like automotive parts. But she also used strategic tactics to buy time.
Sheinbaum says she's going to announce the response, the content of her response and retaliation on Sunday. The Mexican president also called for better cooperation between countries to fight the opioid crisis.
Sheinbaum focused on highlighting the economic consequences of Trump's decisions, particularly the adverse effects on U.S. businesses, including major agriculture and automotive companies that would be hit hard by retaliatory measures. Behind the scenes, Sheinbaum's team conducted quiet diplomacy with U.S. lawmakers, business leaders, and lobbyists, pointing out that the tariffs would disrupt the entire supply chain and drive up costs for U.S. consumers.
The CBS Bay Area saw that the prices for guacamole went from $13 a bowl to almost $17 a bowl because those restaurateurs were anticipating a spike in those agricultural prices.
For example, U.S. farmers, especially in Texas and California, relied heavily on Mexican imports of goods like corn, soybeans, and avocados. If those products were hit with tariffs in retaliation, the agricultural sector would face severe losses, affecting not just the farmers, but also the consumers who would bear the increased cost.
So really, it punctuates the importance of this call between the two presidents. What do you know about how well they're communicating and whether they can actually find common ground to get a deal done?
He was able to highlight some of the results that the Mexican government has presented just in the past month, and she did mention the fact that if he were to impose the tariffs, then what would be the incentives for the Mexican government to continue to cooperate on these matters?
Sheinbaum's leadership style was a mix of measured calm and firm resolve. She knew that Mexico could not afford to escalate matters immediately, given its economic ties to the U.S. At the same time, she couldn't let Mexico's sovereignty be compromised by Trump's aggressive tariffs. So, Mexico's diplomatic tactics were about striking a delicate balance. Publicly, Sheinbaum delivered speeches of unity, speaking about Mexico's national pride, sovereignty, and its long-standing contributions to the U.S. economy.
U.S. allies to reach a permanent resolution, a permanent deal. But the fact of the matter is that the deadlines of each month that have been delayed.
But behind closed doors, Mexico's diplomatic efforts were just as strong. Sheinbaum and her team weren't simply talking to the media or organizing protests. They were working directly with U.S. industry leaders, making the case that imposing tariffs on Mexican goods would harm U.S. businesses far more than it would harm Mexico.
Nonetheless, the price hikes that you mentioned are also affecting our side of the border, and some of the manufacturers as well as the farmers.
The public rally held in Mexico City's Zocalo Square was one of the most visible manifestations of Sheinbaum's approach. Thousands of Mexicans waved flags and expressed their unity in opposition to Trump's tariffs. But the event wasn't just about emotion. It was a strategic move to show the U.S. that Mexico was united and resolute. Sheinbaum's speech resonated with the crowd as she emphasized the importance of respect for Mexico's sovereignty and called for dignity in international trade. This rally was not just a show of force. It was a message that Mexico would not back down under pressure.
Government of Mexico will do in order to alleviate some of these measures. The president has kept her cards very close to the chest, and she hasn't revealed any type of reciprocal tariffs, which were expected to be announced this coming Sunday, but she said that.
Yet, despite this public posturing, Sheinbaum never acted impulsively. She waited for the right moment to act, knowing that Mexico's economy couldn't afford to rush into retaliation without considering the consequences. In March 2025, Sheinbaum had a direct conversation with Trump, emphasizing that Mexico was ready to take action if necessary, but that they still sought a peaceful resolution. This phone call marked a turning point. Mexico's diplomatic efforts bore fruit when Trump agreed to delay tariffs on many Mexican goods, giving the two nations a brief reprieve. It wasn't a permanent win, but it was enough to avoid the immediate catastrophe that tariffs would have brought to Mexico's economy.
She said that in view of this delay, there is no need to even talk about those reciprocal tariffs anymore.
Well, those farmers on your side of the border are also voters, and no doubt President Sheinbaum is feeling some of that political pressure.
The no capitulation stance that Sheinbaum took wasn't just about rejecting tariffs. It was a rejection of being economically coerced by a much larger neighbor. She demonstrated that even as the most vulnerable economy in North America, Mexico had the power to influence negotiations through careful strategy, diplomacy, and unity. Mexico was no longer a passive actor in the trade dispute. It had become an equal player, ready to push back against. This domino effect didn't just affect the auto or energy industries. It triggered a cascade of economic consequences that rippled through the entire U.S. economy. As if that wasn't enough, Canada's role in this growing North American power struggle only added fuel to the fire. In February 2025, when the U.S. imposed a 25% tariff on Canadian goods, Canada responded by levying its own 25% tariffs on $21 billion worth of U.S. products.
This is Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum, the most powerful woman in the world.
To the news of President Trump giving Mexico a 1-month reprieve from his latest tariffs. But you see right there behind me, we are well into negative territory again today.
This retaliation wasn't just symbolic. It directly targeted industries that the U.S. relied on, including steel, aluminum, and consumer goods. Canada became a key player in this escalating trade war, proving that it was not only Mexico that could retaliate. By strategically imposing these tariffs, Canada didn't just stand by while the U.S. engaged in this protectionist strategy. The message was clear: Canada would not be pushed around. In addition to the tariffs, Canada began to pivot away from the U.S., increasingly seeking trade deals with Europe and Asia. Canada had long been one of the U.S.'s closest trading partners, but the imposition of tariffs on Canadian goods prompted a massive shift in trade priorities. The EU, in particular, provided diplomatic support, helping Canada diversify its trade relationships. This pivot to Europe and Asia wasn't just about finding new markets. It was a clear response to the growing uncertainty of relying on the U.S. Canada's move was seen as an existential shift in the North American trade balance, as it signaled that Canada was willing to reduce its reliance on the U.S. in favor of strengthening ties with other global economic powers.
On Sunday, more than 100,000 of Sheinbaum's supporters rallied in Mexico City to celebrate the country being exempted from tariffs on goods covered by an existing trade agreement.
The immediate impact on the U.S. economy was undeniable. With Canada and Mexico, two of its largest trading partners, imposing retaliatory tariffs, the U.S. faced rising costs across key sectors. Automotive and energy industries were hit hardest. But it wasn't just about these sectors. The whole supply chain began to crumble. The coal industry was one of the hardest hit by Canada's actions. In particular, Canada blocking coal exports through British Columbia impacted the U.S. coal industry severely.
Trump said he made the decision out of respect for Sheinbaum. Many have put it down to Sheinbaum's negotiating skills.
With the U.S. losing critical access to one of its key export routes, transportation costs for U.S. coal companies skyrocketed. Losing this critical access to Asian markets, where coal was a major commodity, cost the U.S. billions and severely hurt the industry, which had already been struggling to maintain profitability. Trump's America First policy was supposed to protect U.S. industries, but instead, it began to backfire. The economic pressures caused by tariffs quickly mounted, and not just in the industries targeted by Mexico and Canada. As tariffs on Mexican and Canadian imports increased, the production costs for many goods, from cars to steel, began to rise rapidly.
Claudia Sheinbaum enjoys an 85% approval rating. 85, that's 85. I mean, that is a number almost unheard of in democracies today.
As costs increased, businesses were forced to pass those costs on to consumers, causing price hikes on everyday goods. The agriculture lobby, which had been a key supporter of Trump, quickly turned against him as Mexico's retaliatory tariffs hit U.S. agricultural exports hard. Farmers in Texas and California, who relied heavily on exports to Mexico, found themselves with a shrinking market and rising costs, further exacerbating the agricultural crisis. Trump's dilemma became increasingly clear as the tariffs, intended to protect U.S. industries, instead destabilized critical supply chains. In trying to protect certain industries, Trump had inadvertently set off a chain reaction that raised costs across the board. The price of goods continued to rise, jobs were put at risk, and the economy faced mounting pressures. This backlash from the U.S. business community and foreign governments forced Trump into a corner, as the economic fallout of his tariff policies became increasingly apparent.
Handling of the relationship with the United States has most likely only boosted that approval level. She's been seen as having a sort of calm, steady hand in these negotiations.
After the 2025 election cycle, Trump found himself facing the consequences of his economic policies. The trade wars had become a liability, with voters growing concerned about rising consumer prices and job insecurity. The promise of protecting domestic industries was drowned out by the rising costs that directly affected American families. For Trump, the tariffs had become not just an economic issue, but a political one that could undermine his re-election prospects as more and more Americans began to feel the pressure of rising prices and economic instability. The world is still waiting to see Trump's next move, so if you're curious, hit that subscribe button as we'll be the first to bring you the latest updates.